66-year-old document drafted by an international committee have to do with the reasons that thousands of people of all generations, classes, and colors all across the country have been marching in the streets and lying down to block expressways in the past week. This is what I hope to explore this morning. This coming Wednesday is Human Rights Day, the anniversary of the adoption by the United Nations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10th, 1948. As many of you know, I am Chatham's town representative to the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission, and every year we celebrate Human Rights Day with a breakfast at Hyannis, at which we give awards to Cape Cod people who have advanced human rights this year. If you're interested in attending with me this Wednesday morning, come see me after the service. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put together in 1947 and 1948 by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. The Allies in World War II had articulated that the war effort was being prosecuted to protect four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. The United Nations was established at the end of the war, and its charter, quote, reaffirmed faith in fundamental human rights and the worth and dignity of the human person, unquote. But as the horrors of the Third Reich came to light, this general description did not seem adequate, and so a commission was formed to try to spell out what human rights were. Mrs. Roosevelt did not want the document to be a treaty, that is, to have the force of law. Rather, she wanted it to be like the U.S. Declaration of Independence, a statement of ideals. In this, she proved foresighted, for many countries have incorporated the Declaration into their founding documents. Now, many of you are already yawning, because after all, what could be more bland, more motherhood and apple pie, more ho-hum than the anniversary of an exercise drafted by a bunch of do-gooders of a liberal manifesto? The words read like our seven principles, and that is no coincidence, because they have been ideas that have been kicking around for a long time. To wit, Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or any other limitation of sovereignty. Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 6, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Article 7, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. They sound real bland, right? Until you realize they're the positive statement of what a bunch of people, myself included, feel is wrong with what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island, New York in the last week. When I say positive statement, I mean a rule of law expressed positively. All persons have the right to so and so. Expressing it negatively would be say, no person shall deprive another of so and so. Now, I titled this sermon, Antidote to Evil, but you will all recognize this as a naive concept. If I'm bitten by a rattlesnake, I can take an antivenom, which is an antidote to the snake's poison, and will keep that poison from harming me. but it's not so simple with evil. But I use that word antidote to suggest that this was the intent of the people who put together the Universal Declaration. Not that it was going to be self-executing, as if we could just tack it up to every courthouse door and all evil beings will shrink back into their lairs. But they, the drafters, wanted to enunciate a positive standard in the hopes that this standard would give guidance to people everywhere. Many people believe that the current age is more violent than any that has gone before, that the human race is in a death spiral, that Armageddon is at hand. This is a cherished belief of Christian conservatives. Against this, Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker wrote his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, in 2011, arguing that the human race is actually getting less violent, and the cause is that governments are assuming more and more of a monopoly on the use of deadly force. Is this true? Let's look specifically at the age in which Eleanor Roosevelt and her colleagues were working, immediately after the defeat of the Third Reich. Nevertheless, nowadays, people often hold up the Third Reich as the embodiment of evil. And certainly there have been few regimes in history which have set out so systematically to kill whole categories of people. The Nuremberg trials had convicted and sentenced to death many of the Nazi leaders. But concentrating on the Nazis and on the death camps does not tell nearly the whole story. I recently came across a review of a book which came out in 2010 called Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder, a Yale professor. The reviewer was Ann Applebaum in the New York Review of Books. Americans typically see World War II as starting when America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. What this book does is to discuss the entire period from 1933 to 1950 and to look at the actions not only of the Germans but of the Soviets, who were first allied with the Germans and then split with them. Looked at in this perspective, the number of people who were killed was more like 14 million than 6 million. The reviewer says the title of this book, Bloodlands, is not a metaphor. Snyder's Bloodlands, which others have called Borderlands, runs from Poznan in the west to Smolensk in the east, encompassing modern Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, and the edge of western Russia. This is the region that experienced not one, but two, and sometimes three wartime occupations. This is also the region that suffered the most casualties and endured the worst physical destruction. This region was also the site of most of the politically motivated killing in Europe, killing that began not in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but in 1933 with the famine in Ukraine. Between 1933 and 1945, 14 million people died there, not in combat, but because someone made a deliberate decision to murder them. These deaths took place in Bloodlands and not accidentally so. Hitler and Stalin rose to power in Berlin and Moscow, writes Snyder, but their visions of transformation concerned above all the lands between. The book goes on to say that most of the people who perished were not taken to special death camps, nor were they worked to death in concentration camps. Occupying armies would round up people in particular categories: Jews, Ukrainians, Poles, often with the help of their neighbors, and simply take them out in the woods and shoot them within a mile of where they lived. This bloodbath in the mid-20th century would seem to go against Pinker's idea that a state monopoly on deadly force leads to less violence. But the states involved were dictatorships, which operated totally outside of the moral rules which were codified in the Universal Declaration in 1948. All this was dimly appreciated by the people who drafted the Declaration. For the victors were setting up the script, and the victors included the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, as we know now, was responsible for at least as many deaths as the Third Reich. That's the way the concept of evil works. We want to see it in pure terms. The good guys are here, the bad guys are here. But the reality is usually more complicated. What happened in Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Western Russia between 1933 and 1950 was a combination of two dictatorial systems fighting each other and killing large segments of the population for their own geopolitical ends. One of these two systems was defeated militarily, and its top leadership were held to account in a makeshift legal tribunal. The other system was victorious and was never held to account, but died in its own weight 4 decades later. Now let's turn the page to human rights today. I don't want to spend more time today discussing the Soviet Union or present-day Russia or the protesters in Hong Kong, because we have a full-throated protest movement going on in this country right now, and it is led and fueled by millennials. That's right, the generation we old boomers were just writing off as apathetic and self-absorbed, and that's a hoot for boomers to look at any other age group as self-absorbed. The millennials are now in the streets of America's cities protesting and stopping traffic. They are black and white and Latino. They are outraged. Now, I don't want to imply that the rest of us aren't. This is the most hopeful thing to me, is the millennials are. I am outraged that a Missouri grand jury did not indict Officer Wilson in the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And I am outraged that a Staten Island grand jury did not indict the New York police officer in the chokehold death of Eric Garner. I have gone to a small demonstration in Hyannis on the Ferguson case. Yet in looking at these things, I can't unlearn the things I know from my former career as a criminal defense lawyer. Generally, juries, grand juries and petit juries, try hard to do the right thing. They listen to the evidence, and they have to weigh one witness against another, or the eyewitnesses against the scientific findings. The news media, on the other hand, report what they can find, but the public does not know nearly as much about the gritty details of the case as the grand jury or trial jury which hears it. Much of what happens in any legal proceeding, let's face it, is deadly dull. And the news media have to leave out a lot to make a 90-second slot on the 6 o'clock news that will attract enough eyes to make it worthwhile for their advertisers to put money up to support the station. In Ferguson, though, so I had this normal feeling that we outsiders who were not there in the jury room can't really make a judgment. But in Ferguson, the prosecutor took the extraordinary step of releasing the entire hearing transcript. This bothers me a lot. We've had people in this congregation that served on grand juries. The part of the grand jury's secrecy is to protect the grand juror, you know, because they handle some very explosive cases, and they want to go home in security and eat their supper with their spouses. So having these things released is a bit disturbing, but that gave us an insight on what the grand jury actually heard. It was clear to me, as a lawyer, that the prosecutor was steering the whole thing toward a no bill. That was what outraged me. And I've suggested publicly that the family try for the appointment of a special prosecutor and the convening of another grand jury. You see, a person can endure many grand jury proceedings because they're not placed in jeopardy under the Fifth Amendment by a grand jury proceeding. However, I have to say the caveat to that is, even if a zealous prosecutor can be found, the evidence in the case seems riddled with contradictions to the point where I think it would be unlikely that a trial jury would find Officer Wilson guilty of anything beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, how can we square this with our own sense of outrage? When I raised these tactical worries in social media, one of my white ministerial colleagues said she was not responding rationally or analytically just now because she wanted to be in solidarity with our colleagues of color. I felt differently. I think cases like these require us to use every bit of discernment we have, heart and mind. If police killings target people of color more than whites, as these cases in the news suggest they do, that is not just a problem for people of color. It is a problem for all of us. And we are called to be allies with our friends and colleagues of color, for they stand in harm's way. But we're not called to put aside all of the analytical tools at our disposal. Each case has a frustrating tendency not to fall into anyone's stereotypes, but to have facts peculiar to it. Juries, grand and petit juries, will focus on all the evidence they hear, while the news media will focus on the most sensational things. Thus we simplify. White cop shoots unarmed black citizen. But in almost every case, other factors come to weigh in the deliberations. The question we need to be asking is whether the data in these cases show a trend. Brian Burghardt is one journalist who recently set out to get the answer to this question. He was shocked to find that it wasn't available in a 5-minute search on the internet. In fact, with all the data collection the government does, it appears that at no level does government collect data on how many civilians are killed by police. Burghardt has decided to build his own database. He has started a website called Fatal Encounters, and he is asking the public to help him. He also claims that police fatalities are on the rise, and the media are ignoring it. For example, he puts out some suggested numbers. In Bernalillo County, New Mexico, 3 people were killed by police in 2012. In 2013, 5. In Shelby County, Tennessee, 9 people were killed by police in 2012. In 2013, it was 11. Burghardt not only contends that citizen fatalities by police are on the rise, but that this news is being ignored by media outlets across the country. He also concludes that in urban areas, the most frequent victim of police killing is black men, while in rural areas, the most frequent victim is mentally ill men. But there is a conceptual problem. Each instance of police use of force will carry with it the question of justification. Was the conduct of the citizen sufficient to justify the force that the officer used? And the assessment of justification must be different in each case. The cases are so dependent on their own facts that it is very difficult to spot a trend. And it may be that there is no central registry for police fatalities, but many departments require a report wherever there is a use of force by police. And there is a bureau in the Federal Department of Justice which collects and analyzes these reports. In my own benighted native state of South Carolina, for butt of so many jokes, for example, there are currently 4 police citizen cases in which the officer is being prosecuted criminally, including one murder charge against the police chief of a small town. It cannot be said that there is a uniform trend to let the cop off the hook in every instance. Trends, though, are very hard to spot amid the welter of information. But if police killings are on the rise, it is a concern for all of us. If they target African American men, it is a concern for all of us. If they target the mentally ill, it is a problem for all of us. The guarantees of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sound great, but they're not self-executed. They're only as good as the legal system is willing to enforce them. If it consistently looks the other way, when those we entrust with deadly force abuse that trust, those guarantees of equal treatment will be hollow. We need accountability. We cannot do without the police. They perform a vital function. The front page of yesterday's Cape Cod Times had 2 stories in which law enforcement featured prominently. One was an investigation into massage parlors in the Hyannis area, which might be linked to sex trafficking. The other concerned the epic of opiate addictions and overdoses, in which the police are often the first responders and can save lives. The police usually uphold the values of human rights. One of the awards the Human Rights Commission will give on Wednesday is going to Steve Yarkos, the Deputy Police Chief in Yarmouth. As more guns spread into the citizenry, policing becomes more dangerous. And the cop who is armed never knows which of the people he or she is dealing with may suddenly turn and open fire. The other side of the statistics are the number of police shot by civilians. Yet if we allow police officers to use deadly force, we must create accountability for the use of that force. There needs to be a central database for all use of force incidents if there's not one already, and fatalities should be treated as a special category in that database. Perhaps most importantly, cases involving police use of force should not be handled by the same prosecutors who must work with the police officers on regular cases day in and day out. Accountability is not a black concern or a white concern. It is a human concern. Where those invested with government power do not feel constrained to use it lawfully, we have a tyranny and not a government of laws. If you look back at the history of the extreme violence in the mid-20th century, there was no accountability there, and most of the perpetrators of that violence were never held accountable. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. I have to remember my high school Latin. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Who will guard the guardians? The issue is as old as Plato and as new as yesterday's headlines. I will close with this thought from St. Augustine. Hope has two beautiful